She handed her son an eviction notice on New Year's Day, right after watching him pop champagne in her living room. "Mom, what is this?" he stammered. Joan didn't blink. "Your lease. You signed it, Merry January." The room froze. His wife dropped her phone. No one laughed this time, because Joan had just turned the house they mocked into the trap they walked into. "All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from." Sometimes it's not the shout that breaks you. It's the whisper across a dinner table. The late morning sun spilled through the tall bay windows of Joan's dining room, warming the hardwood floors she had polished by hand just days before. The air smelled of cinnamon rolls, fresh coffee, and citrus polish, a comforting blend of tradition and care. Joan, 66, moved between the table and the kitchen with practiced grace, setting down second helpings of fruit salad and bacon as laughter bubbled around her like a song she knew by heart. She wore her best pearl button cardigan, the one Chris always said reminded him of his childhood. Hosting brunch had been her idea, a spontaneous, warm gesture to bring her son and daughter-in-law over. She had even trimmed the rose bushes by the porch just for the occasion. Her house, the one she'd built with her late husband over 3 decades ago, looked pristine, alive, full. Joan was humming softly as she collected the empty dishes from the table, the kind of hum that meant things were okay, until she reached the threshold of the kitchen and stopped. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but some words aren't whispered low enough. April's voice floated through the clinking of cutlery. "Old people shouldn't own big houses. It's selfish, honestly. Younger families need space more." The sentence sliced through the air like a sharp wind under the door. Joan didn't move. She stood with a glass in one hand, her breath caught, her ears suddenly ringing. She wasn't sure what stung more, the arrogance in April's tone or how casually it had been said, like an observation about the weather. The woman was seated at her table, sipping from her fine china, eating food Joan had made, in a home built with sweat and memories, and still, that's what she thought of her place. Joan stepped softly back into the kitchen, eyes wide but dry, her posture erect as if nothing had happened. She placed the plate in the sink slowly, letting the faucet mask the pounding in her chest. From the dining room, April's voice rose again, louder this time, performative. "She should start packing, she's almost done anyway." A few guests chuckled awkwardly. One of them was Chris. Joan didn't hear him defend her. He didn't even flinch. Her fingers curled around the handle of her coffee mug so tightly, her knuckles paled. The ceramic felt hot against her palm, but she didn't let go. She stood there, silently, as if the warmth might scald away the sting in her chest. Her heart beat harder than it should have, but not from sadness, from something sharper. She stared out the window above her sink. The backyard was still lush. Her late husband had loved gardening. His old tools were still hanging in the shed, right where he'd left them. They had raised Chris in this house, hosted every holiday, made it a sanctuary. And now it was nothing more than a square-footage argument for April's next power play. In that moment, Joan understood something with crystalline clarity. They didn't just want her gone, they thought she was already halfway out. She took one deep breath and whispered to herself, low and cold, "If they want houses so badly, maybe it's time they learn to pay rent for theirs. No theatrics, no confrontation, no slam doors." Joan placed her coffee cup down with care, wiped her trembling hands on a dish towel, and walked back toward the table with a smile so steady it was unsettling. The laughter continued. The brunch resumed, but Joan's mind was already elsewhere, filing through legal terms, phone numbers, old friends with sharp suits and sharper advice. She sat down again, took a sip of coffee, and smiled sweetly at April. "Oh, don't worry, dear," she said, tilting her head just slightly. "You may get your wish sooner than you think." Her smile faded the moment her guests left. Alone again in her kitchen, she opened the drawer where her old deed papers were kept, then reached for her phone. It was time to plan a move no one saw coming. The deadliest betrayals aren't delivered with fists, they're whispered through walls, carried like pollen on the wind, unnoticed, until they take root. Joan's knees creaked as she knelt beside her flower beds, the morning sun warm against her back. She pressed her gloved hands into the dark soil, feeling its cool weight between her fingers. Roses, hydrangeas, lilacs, all blooming proudly from the ground she and her late husband once tamed together. Every blossom carried a memory, a Sunday afternoon, a shared laugh over uneven rows, the day they planted a maple tree to celebrate their mortgage finally being paid off. "They see square footage," Joan whispered to herself as she clipped a spent bloom, her voice soft but bitter. "I see decades of my life growing roots." The clink of coffee cups and the low hum of conversation drifted from the open patio door behind her. She hadn't been trying to listen, but how could she not, when her own son and daughter-in-law made no effort to lower their voices? "We could easily knock out that old study and make a bigger nursery," April said brightly, her tone thick with entitlement. Chris grunted, distracted. "Would have to convince Mom to move, though." "Nudge her," April replied with a smirk Joan could hear even without seeing. "You know, gently. Mention the stairs are getting dangerous, that it's too much house for one person. That sort of thing." Joan snipped another flower with precision, the shears clicking sharply in the stillness. A quiet, brutal sound. It wasn't the first time she'd heard the whispers, but today, something inside her pivoted, not toward sadness but toward a colder, clearer resolve. She stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees, and stared out at her garden, the only audience that understood the weight of her heart. She thought of her husband's rough hands planting saplings, his voice reassuring her when the mortgage felt like a mountain, the Christmas lights they strung across the eaves together, year after year, memories they now dismissed as obstacles to their own comfort. If they were planning renovations, they should prepare for bigger changes than a wall or two. By the next morning, Joan sat at a corner booth in the same sun-faded diner she and her husband had once celebrated their first mortgage payment. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, but Joan barely touched her cup. Across from her sat Mr. Dales, her old real estate agent, older now, but still sharp behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "You sure you're ready for this, Joan?" he asked, tapping the table lightly. Joan folded her hands carefully, steady as stone. "I've been ready for longer than I realized." Dales nodded thoughtfully and pulled a worn leather folder from his briefcase. He slid it across the table, the edge whispering against the formica. "There's ways to own without appearing to own. Ways to keep control. And keep the ungrateful guessing." Joan ran her fingertips over the folder, feeling the weight of possibility thrum beneath the surface. She glanced out the window, beyond the diner's parking lot. The world shimmered under the mid-morning sun. A world that would never hand you respect. You had to stake your claim and defend it. "Let's talk," she said, voice low but ironclad. "About buying back my power, without selling my soul." Dales smiled, sly and knowing. He opened the folder and the first page shone under the diner's weak lights. Limited Liability Company Formation Agreement. Joan's mouth curved into a small, private smile. They wanted her gone? They were about to find out she hadn't even started yet. Joan leaned closer, her hand poised over the pen, while Dales quietly said, "Let's build something they'll never see coming." Some battles aren't fought with fists. They're signed into existence with a black pen and a knowing smile. The legal office smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, the air humming with a quiet authority Joan hadn't felt in years. She sat straight-backed across from Mr. Dales, who spread a stack of official documents across the glossy table like a deck of cards. Each page was a weapon, not of destruction but of reclamation. Joan picked up the fountain pen with steady hands. The same hands that once stitched Halloween costumes by candlelight, that once baked birthday cakes with butter-slicked fingers, that once paid overdue tuition bills without question. Now, those hands moved with quiet, surgical precision. "You're forming an LLC," Dales explained, tapping the top document. "The house title transfers under it. You'll be the sole managing member. You keep every thread of control, and they won't even realize the safety net they think they own has been pulled away." Joan nodded, her mind already ahead, weaving through the possibilities. Ownership without visibility. Power without confrontation. Her husband's voice echoed from long ago, one of their late-night conversations at the kitchen table. Paper trails matter, Joni. Never sign your freedom away, not even to family. Especially not to family. With a breath as steady as the ocean tides, Joan signed the first document. The pen moved with finality, the ink biting into the paper like a seal of quiet revenge. "Congratulations," Dale said warmly. "You're now the managing member of Joan's Hearth LLC. Joan allowed herself a rare, wicked smile. That evening, the family gathered again around the sprawling dining room table, platters of food steaming between them. The scent of roasted garlic, fresh bread, and her famous honey-glazed carrots filled the house. April's laugh cut sharply through the comfort, piercing the moment like a needle. "You know, Mom," April said, swirling wine lazily in her glass, "maybe it's time you finally think about downsizing. Big house like this, so much wasted space." Chris chuckled weakly, reaching for a roll but avoiding Joan's eyes. Joan set her fork down carefully, savoring the beat of silence that followed. She felt the weight of her signature in her pocket, felt the legal shield now wrapped invisibly around her, thicker and stronger than any brick wall. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the sheer arrogance in April's voice, but Joan couldn't resist. She tilted her head, smiling sweetly. "Maybe sooner than you think, dear." April blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected agreement. For a fleeting moment, a gleam of victory danced in her eyes. Joan sipped her tea, cool and deliberate, hiding the hurricane gathering just behind her calm exterior. Because what they didn't know was that the house was no longer just a house. It was now a fortress, and Joan held every key. The chandelier flickered above them as if the house itself sensed the shift. Joan's fingers brushed the papers tucked inside her purse under the table. Soon, very soon, they would learn. Assumptions are the most expensive mistakes. And Joan? She was done paying for anyone's comfort but her own. Joan rose from the table, her chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor, leaving behind nothing but her serene smile and the silent countdown to their rude awakening. They trusted the woman who sewed their Halloween costumes. That was their first mistake. Joan sat at the dining table early that morning, the same table where she'd once glued googly eyes to homemade monsters for Chris's second-grade costume party. Her fingers now traced the edge of the folder in front of her, sturdy, discreet, and deceptively vanilla. Inside, 5 simple pages. To the untrained eye, they looked like basic estate documents. To Joan, they were freedom. The smell of brewed coffee lingered in the air as Chris and April entered, all fake cheer and shallow charm. "Mom, you said this was just some future planning stuff?" Chris asked, already eyeing the papers with disinterest. "Just the usual end-of-life formalities," Joan said, her tone light, almost breezy. "Nothing too serious. A lawyer friend said it's smart to formalize things while I'm still healthy." April beamed, practically bouncing as she took her seat. "I've been telling Chris we needed to get ahead of this, so glad you're thinking of the future." Of course she was. Joan placed pens on the table, then slid the top sheet forward. "Just a few signatures where it's marked. You're listed as family trustees. Standard language." Chris, hesitant but trusting, flipped through the first 2 pages, squinting like he was scanning, but not really absorbing a word. April didn't even pretend. She grabbed the pen, signed on every dotted line in seconds, then glanced at Joan with that syrupy smile. "This is great, Joan. You're being so responsible." Joan simply nodded, her hands calm, her pulse unreadable. Neither of them noticed the fine print amendment Joan had quietly inserted the night before. It was nestled neatly within the estate transition clause, a simple redirect of residential authority to the managing member of the LLC in the event of any residency overlap. Legalese for, "You now live in my house by lease, not love." No raised eyebrows, no suspicions. They trusted her, just enough to be careless. After all, This was the woman who used to leave surprise chocolates on their pillows during holidays, the woman who crocheted April's maternity blanket, who taught Chris how to balance his checkbook back when he still asked. Once the ink dried, Joan stacked the papers methodically, giving each signature the reverence it deserved. Then she smiled, gentle and polite. "I'll drop these off with the estate attorney later this week. Thank you both. It really gives me peace of mind." Chris kissed her cheek on his way out. April lingered for a second. "You know, once we do inherit this place, maybe we can finally get that pool installed." Joan just smiled again, too kindly. "Pools can be expensive. Best to plan ahead." As their car pulled out of the driveway, Joan stood at the front window, watching the taillights vanish like fading memories. Then she turned, walked to her study, and opened the drawer. She slid the freshly signed documents inside, and beneath them, a crisp new sheet of paper printed on ivory linen stock. Occupancy lease agreement. She tucked it into a separate folder labeled Active. The smell of lilies from the hallway vase drifted through the room, mixing with the faint scent of ink and paper. Joan closed the drawer softly, and for the first time in years, the house felt like hers again. Joan locked the drawer, whispering to no one but the quiet room around her. Time to teach them what living here really costs. They decorated my house for Christmas. I decorated their future with fine print. Joan hadn't planned to spend Christmas Eve in her own sunroom, sipping mulled wine alone. But then again, she hadn't planned to host a party she wasn't invited to, at her own house. From behind the sheer curtain, she watched the twinkling lights flicker on the tree that April had picked out without asking. The scent of pine needles and cinnamon potpourri drifted through the hallway, but it did nothing to mask the bitter tang of entitlement in the air. Laughter erupted from the living room, loud, carefree, careless. April was dressed in a shimmering red jumpsuit, holding court like a queen who believed the castle was already hers. Chris poured drinks, offering his mother's antique crystal glasses to guests who called her adorable when she walked in the room and outdated when she left it. The fireplace roared, so did Joan's resolve. A week ago, the lease had become official. The signatures were in place. The house, though unchanged in brick and beams, now had a different heartbeat, a legal one. Joan had become not just a homeowner, but a landlord. And tonight, her tenants were throwing themselves a celebration she never approved. She stepped quietly into the room, unnoticed for a moment. Then April's voice rang out, bright and piercing. "There she is! Everyone, let's toast to Joan, who's been so sweet about letting us host here. Honestly, we should just move in permanently." She laughed like it was a joke, but her eyes gleamed like it was a plan. Joan didn't smile, she just nodded. After the guests left, the house was quiet again. Joan walked through the wreckage, wine stains on her white runner, pine needles scattered like shrapnel, a broken ornament under the console table. It wasn't just a party, it was a preview of what they thought the future would be, but their future had already been rewritten. New Year's Day came crisp and gray. Joan made pancakes for herself, blueberry, the way her husband liked them, and then placed a single envelope on the breakfast bar where Chris always dropped his car keys. Inside was the first rent notice, a polite professional letter on plain stationery. Per your signed agreement under the Living Legacy Trust LLT-07A, monthly occupancy fees shall begin January 1st, payable by the 5th of each month. Failure to remit payment within 10 days shall result in breach of lease consequences, including eviction procedures. At noon, Chris found the letter. "Mom!" His voice cracked as he read, flipping the page like it might change if he read it twice. "You can't be serious." Joan looked up from her crossword puzzle, glasses perched low on her nose. Her tone was steady. "It's all in the paperwork, Chris. You both signed it. Page 7. April stormed into the kitchen behind him, red-faced, eyes wide. "This is insane. We're family. You're going to charge us rent to live in the house we were going to inherit?" Joan's eyes didn't waver. "You assumed ownership. I drafted opportunity." Chris rubbed his temples. "You blindsided us." Joan leaned back in her chair. "No, dear. I sat right here while you signed every line." April clenched her fists. You're punishing us. Joan's voice softened, almost motherly. Number, I'm teaching you the difference between assumption and entitlement. April scoffed and grabbed the letter. We'll fight this. Joan stood slowly, walked to the kitchen drawer, and pulled out a copy of the notarized lease. Then I suggest you read what you're fighting. She left them standing there, Chris with guilt, April with rage, as she returned to her sunroom. Outside, snow had begun to fall, dusting the garden she once planted with her husband. Inside, the house was warm, but only for those who understood what it cost to keep it that way. April slammed her fist on the counter. Chris whispered, half begging, half broken, "Mom, please tell me this isn't real." Joan, without turning, replied softly, "Rent is due on the 5th. You didn't read the fine print? Neither did I forget the fine hurt. Chris hadn't looked this pale since his high school report card came in all C's, but this time there wasn't a makeup test, only a lease agreement with a countdown clock. We can't afford to move right now," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck as if the stress was something he could scratch away. April stood beside him in the kitchen, arms crossed tight enough to strangle the sleeves of her blouse. "You're bluffing. No court would side with you. You're our mother." Joan sat calmly at the breakfast table, a cup of chamomile tea steaming in front of her. She didn't blink, didn't stir, just smiled. "Page 9, she said softly. Paragraph 3. Early termination fees, minimum 90-day notice, or full monthly rent due within 30 days. Chris sank into the chair across from her. "You knew we wouldn't read it." Joan looked at him with something like pity. "I knew you'd treat it like every other document I've signed for you, invisible ink until you needed it." April scoffed. "This is a power play. You're punishing us because of one offhand comment at brunch." Joan raised a single brow. "That offhand comment wasn't offhand. It was a summary of everything you've thought for years, that I'm too old, too slow, too obsolete." She stood slowly, walking to the sideboard, her fingers brushing the frame of an old photograph. She didn't hand it to them, just looked at it for a beat too long. "Do you know what it feels like to host birthdays, Thanksgivings, and holidays, only to be called selfish in your own kitchen?" Her voice was low, thick, dangerous. Chris looked away. April tried again, this time more gently. "Joan, please, we didn't mean to hurt you. We were just talking about the future." Joan turned. "So was I." Flashback. Joan slicing coupons late at night, making sure Chris could go on every school field trip. Joan standing in the cold, cheering at his college graduation, despite her hip aching for hours. Joan handing over a check to help cover April's maternity leave, without being asked. Joan giving up her anniversary cruise when Chris and April's first home had a plumbing disaster. No one remembered those sacrifices, but Joan did. "I never forgot the fine hurt," she said aloud now. "All those moments I stayed silent, all the times I put you ahead of myself. Consider this, delayed interest." Chris leaned forward, hands clasped. "We'll pay, but we need time, please." April bit her lip. "An extension, a temporary delay. We're family." Joan took a long sip of her tea. The room was so quiet you could hear the ceramic clink as the cup hit the saucer. "I already gave you 30 years, she said, standing again. "Now you have 30 days. She walked out of the kitchen, the weight of her decision lifting with every step. April stared after her, breath caught halfway in her throat. Chris looked at the lease on the table, reading it again. Not out of confusion now, but in realization. Every line was watertight. Joan had always been generous, but she'd never been stupid. And this time, she wasn't backing down. On the last page of the lease, bolded in red, "First rent payment due February 1st. Failure to pay initiates eviction protocol per Clause 7 BI." Chris circled the date on the calendar with a trembling hand. April whispered almost to herself, "She really did it. She actually turned us into tenants. They set my table without a seat for me. Now I own the dining room." The check came folded in 3, sealed in a plain white envelope addressed in Chris's neat but begrudging handwriting. Joan opened it slowly, not out of suspense, but satisfaction. She ran her fingers over the ink as if touching proof of something deeper than payment. Obedience, perhaps, or guilt finally given a price. The rent amount was modest compared to the worth of the house, but it wasn't about the money. It was the principle. It was the sound of entitlement breaking. She deposited it before noon. By the afternoon, Joan stood beneath the soft fluorescent lights of a local dealership, her hand resting on the roof of a deep burgundy luxury sedan. Leather seats, heated steering, no financing. "I'll pay in full," she told the salesman, who blinked. "Would you like to run credit?" he asked automatically. She smiled. Cool, polite, controlled. "No need. It's already full." He stared. She handed over the check stub as if it were a badge. Back home, April paced the living room, arms flailing as Chris sat on the edge of the sofa rubbing his temples. She was in full fury now, the kind that burned bridges while pretending to be constructive. "I told you we should have made her sign something years ago. Who lets their mother control everything at her age?" Chris looked up slowly. "She raised me, paid for our wedding, covered the down payment on this house. And now, she owns it, because we let her." April scoffed. "Number, because you were too passive to lock it down. You left everything in her name like she was some fairy godmother." A memory flickered through Joan's mind, watching from the kitchen doorway last Christmas as April and Chris hosted a dinner without inviting her. She'd dropped off cookies. They'd said thank you, without offering a seat. They had set her table, filled her chairs, and passed around laughter like she was just a delivery woman. She didn't say anything then. But she remembered. And now, those chairs sat beneath her roof, rented. Every clink of their forks, every sip from her wine glasses, cost them. At night, Joan made a simple meal. Rosemary roasted chicken and glazed carrots. She lit a candle in the middle of the table for ambiance and sat at one end, a glass of Chardonnay beside her. She didn't mind the empty seats. They used to sting. Now they symbolized space she'd reclaimed. The doorbell rang once, sharp. She opened it to see April standing, stiffly, arms crossed. Her smile was tight, performative, a script rehearsed. "Hi, Joan. I just wanted to make sure you got the check." Joan nodded. "Bank's already thanked me." April laughed, too high-pitched. "Good. Well, we're doing our part. I mean, we still want things to be amicable." Joan leaned against the doorframe. "Amicables for equals. Right now, I'm your landlord." April's face twitched. "And landlords," Joan continued, "don't do check-ins at dinner time." Without another word, she gently closed the door. Inside the house, the candle still flickered. She sat again, took another bite of her meal, then opened her laptop. A small notification flashed on the corner of the screen. Deposit cleared. Joan smiled. Full accounts, indeed. Later that night, in their shared bedroom, April lay in bed, her laptop casting a bluish hue across her face. She scrolled through forums, searching for something. Anything. She typed keywords: elder financial incompetence, guardianship filings, mental decline, plus legal action. Chris walked in. "What are you doing?" April didn't look up. "Fixing what you failed to protect." April clicked on a forum thread titled, "How to File for Elder Oversight Without Alerting the Senior." She whispered aloud, "We'll just sabotage her legally, make her look unstable." Then hit, save, bookmark. They thought gray hair meant weakness. I was the storm coming. The knock on the door came early. Firm, official. Joan wiped her hands on a dish towel and answered calmly. Two strangers stood on her porch, badges clipped to belts, polite but stiff expressions. One woman, mid-40s, held a clipboard. The other, younger, scanned the interior over Joan's shoulder. "Ms. Joan Redding?" the woman asked. "That's me. We received a formal report about possible cognitive decline and self-neglect. Standard welfare check." Joan blinked. "Really? And who sent that?" The younger agent stepped in gently. "We're not allowed to disclose that at this stage." Joan stepped aside. "Come in, but I'd like to keep the kettle on." As the agents moved through the home, Joan stayed 3 steps ahead. Fresh flowers on the dining table, bills stacked neatly by the mail tray, medications labeled and organized, house spotless, not a stray dish in sight. She offered them tea, served in matching china, her hands steady as stone. She spoke with clarity, recounting her weekly routine, her property documents, the name of her estate lawyer, and the exact rent paid by her tenants. The older agent skimmed through the paperwork Joan offered: lease agreement, medical clearance from her last physical notarized trust documents. "You have everything in order, Ms. Redding," she said with a small, relieved smile. "I try," Joan replied, sipping her tea. Before they left, Joan asked a single question. "You don't happen to know if the report came from a woman with a sharp tongue and a slow memory for her own behavior?" They didn't answer, but the flicker in the younger agent's eye was all the confirmation Joan needed. Once they left, Joan called her lawyer, calm, precise. "I want to file a defamation pre-warning letter, and while we're at it, let's make sure April is removed as my emergency contact. Replace her with someone I trust." Her voice didn't waver, but when she hung up, her smile tightened, not out of fear, out of resolve. That evening she texted April, "Why don't you come by for tea tomorrow?" No hard feelings, just some clearing of the air. April arrived the next afternoon in full charm mode. High heels clicked across Joan's wood floors, her lipstick a shade too bright, her hug a beat too long. "Joan, you look great. I'm so glad we're talking." Joan poured chamomile tea into 2 porcelain cups and nodded toward the cozy sunroom. "I thought we could speak like adults, woman to woman." April took her cup. "I mean, this whole rent thing, it's gotten so twisted, and the welfare visit? Total misunderstanding." Joan arched an eyebrow. "Misunderstanding?" April waved it off. "Chris said it best. You're strong. Just getting older, you know? Everyone worries eventually." Joan tilted her head. "So it was your idea?" April froze, smiled again too quickly. "I mean, maybe I mentioned something to Nora. She's just a friend who knows people. I didn't file anything." Joan leaned back, nodding slowly. "Good to know." April chuckled, sipping her tea. "Honestly, if I had known you'd handle things this well, I wouldn't have bothered." Silence. Joan didn't blink, didn't flinch. What April didn't notice was the small voice recorder nestled beneath the flower vase between them, active, running, every word captured. Later that night, Joan transferred the recording file straight to her lawyer, subject line, "Insurance in case the weather turns stormy." Joan stood at the sunroom window, watching April's car pull away. She murmured, half to herself, half to the house that still belonged to her. They thought gray hair meant weakness. Was the storm coming? Roasted garlic, fresh bread, and her famous honey-glazed carrots filled the house. April's laugh cut sharply through the comfort, piercing the moment like a needle. "You know, Mom," April said, swirling wine lazily in her glass, "maybe it's time you finally think about downsizing. Big house like this, so much wasted space." Chris chuckled weakly, reaching for a roll but avoiding Joan's eyes. Joan set her fork down carefully, savoring the beat of silence that followed. She felt the weight of her signature in her pocket, felt the legal shield now wrapped invisibly around her, thicker and stronger than any brick wall. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the sheer arrogance in April's voice, but Joan couldn't resist. She tilted her head, smiling sweetly. "Maybe sooner than you think, dear." April blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected agreement. For a fleeting moment, a gleam of victory danced in her eyes. Joan sipped her tea, cool and deliberate, hiding the hurricane gathering just behind her calm exterior. Because what they didn't know was that the house was no longer just a house. It was now a fortress, and Joan held every key. The chandelier flickered above them as if the house itself sensed the shift. Joan's fingers brushed the papers tucked inside her purse under the table. Soon, very soon, they would learn. Assumptions are the most expensive mistakes. And Joan? She was done paying for anyone's comfort but her own. Joan rose from the table, her chair scraping softly against the hardwood floor, leaving behind nothing but her serene smile. and the silent countdown to their rude awakening. They trusted the woman who sewed their Halloween costumes. That was their first mistake. Joan sat at the dining table early that morning, the same table where she'd once glued googly eyes to homemade monsters for Chris's second-grade costume party. Her fingers now traced the edge of the folder in front of her, sturdy, discreet, and deceptively vanilla. Inside, 5 simple pages. To the untrained eye, they looked like basic estate documents. To Joan, they were freedom. The smell of brewed coffee lingered in the air as Chris and April entered, all fake cheer and shallow charm. "Mom, you said this was just some future planning stuff?" Chris asked, already eyeing the papers with disinterest. "Just the usual end-of-life formalities," Joan said, her tone light, almost breezy. "Nothing too serious. A lawyer friend said it's smart to formalize things while I'm still healthy." April beamed, practically bouncing as she took her seat. "I've been telling Chris we needed to get ahead of this, so glad you're thinking of the future." Of course she was. Joan placed pens on the table, then slid the top sheet forward. "Just a few signatures where it's marked. You're listed as family trustees. Standard language." Chris, hesitant but trusting, flipped through the first 2 pages, squinting like he was scanning, but not really absorbing a word. April didn't even pretend. She grabbed the pen, signed on every dotted line in seconds, then glanced at Joan with that syrupy smile. "This is great, Joan. You're being so responsible." Joan simply nodded, her hands calm, her pulse unreadable. Neither of them noticed the fine print amendment Joan had quietly inserted the night before. It was nestled neatly within the estate transition clause, a simple redirect of residential authority to the managing member of the LLC in the event of any residency overlap. Legalese for, "You now live in my house by lease, not love." No raised eyebrows, no suspicions. They trusted her, just enough to be careless. After all, this was the woman who used to leave surprise chocolates on their pillows during holidays, the woman who crocheted April's maternity blanket, who taught Chris how to balance his checkbook back when he still asked. Once the ink dried, Joan stacked the papers methodically, giving each signature the reverence it deserved. Then she smiled, gentle and polite. "I'll drop these off with the estate attorney later this week. Thank you both. It really gives me peace of mind." Chris kissed her cheek on his way out. April lingered for a second. "You know, once we do inherit this place, maybe we can finally get that pool installed." Joan just smiled again, too kindly. "Pools can be expensive. Best to plan ahead." As their car pulled out of the driveway, Joan stood at the front window, watching the taillights vanish like fading memories. Then she turned, walked to her study, and opened the drawer. She slid the freshly signed documents inside, and beneath them, a crisp new sheet of paper printed on ivory linen stock. Occupancy lease agreement. She tucked it into a separate folder labeled Active. The smell of lilies from the hallway vase drifted through the room, mixing with the faint scent of ink and paper. Joan closed the drawer softly, and for the first time in years, the house felt like hers again. Joan locked the drawer, whispering to no one but the quiet, tightening around her shoulders like a well-stitched coat. The judge continued, "The lease is valid. The behavior described in the recording, and corroborated by further evidence, proves intention to manipulate and potentially exploit Ms. Fenton. This court finds grounds to enforce eviction." April snapped, "You can't evict your own family." "I can," Joan said softly, standing now. "I just did." Laughter broke out somewhere behind her, then hushed quickly. The judge banged her gavel once. "Case ruled in favor of the plaintiff. Eviction order is signed and effective immediately. Court is adjourned." As everyone stood, April erupted. "This is a setup. You're senile. You tricked us." Phones were already recording. People in the hallway whispered, recognizing her from the viral social posts months ago when April had painted Joan as an unwell senior, being financially irresponsible. Kendra leaned in, whispering to Joan, "You don't need to respond. Let them hang themselves." But Joan didn't respond anyway. She turned, picked up her bag, and walked calmly out of the courtroom as April's meltdown exploded behind her. Outside, the air was crisp. Joan exhaled like she hadn't in years. A reporter with a smartphone mic jogged up, breathless. "Ms. Fenton, can we get a comment on the ruling?" Joan turned slowly, smiled faintly, and adjusted the strap of her bag. "Sometimes the eviction isn't from a house," she said. "It's from someone else's delusion." She walked away before the reporter could ask another question. The next morning, the headline trended on Twitter and local news feeds. "Senior citizen reclaims home from ungrateful heirs, with receipts, recordings, and ruthless grace." Joan folded the newspaper and poured herself a fresh cup of coffee. Black, no sugar. "They packed my memories without care. I packed their dreams into boxes." The moving truck hissed as it backed into the driveway Joan once mowed with her husband on warm spring mornings. Two uniformed movers stepped out, glancing around awkwardly, the kind of tension reserved for eviction day. April stood by the porch, arms crossed, mouth a thin, tight line. Chris shuffled beside her, face drawn, refusing to meet Joan's eyes as he signed the clipboard one final time. "Per court order, we're just here to help them collect personal belongings," one mover said quietly to Joan. She nodded, not breaking her gaze from the front door. "Let them take what's theirs," she said softly. "No more, no less." Inside, boxes thudded onto hardwood floors. Tape screeched as it tore across cardboard. The air smelled of disturbed dust and the citrus cleaner Joan had used that morning, more out of ritual than necessity. She'd already scrubbed the house spotless, not for them, but for herself, for closure. April slammed a drawer. Chris muttered something inaudible. A picture frame fell with a clink. Joan stood in the hallway, out of the way, her presence as loud as a siren. She said nothing, offered no help, gave no final words. They didn't deserve a sentimental goodbye. She watched as April hastily stuffed designer shoes into a duffel bag, shoes once bought with money borrowed just until Christmas. Chris pulled files from the office, files Joan had once organized for him when he needed to refinance his car. The irony dripped from every movement. Flashback, Joan in the backyard years ago. Her hands dirt-stained, sun on her neck, laughter echoing as her husband handed her a rosebush in a clay pot. "Let's plant something that outlives us," he'd said. She had. And it had. Back in the present, Joan stepped outside, walked to the garden, and crouched beside that same rosebush, now full, vibrant, thorned and blooming. She placed a gloved hand gently on its stem. No words, just breathe, just being. By mid-afternoon, the house was emptied of everything that wasn't hers. She walked each room in silence, her heels tapping against the wooden floors like punctuation marks to a final letter. The kitchen, spotless. The dining room, still echoing laughter that didn't belong to them anymore. Upstairs, the guest room smelled faintly of perfume. Joan opened the windows. Let the wind sweep it away. In the living room, something white on the mantel caught her eye. A letter, her name scribbled across the front in a rushed, angry scrawl. She didn't need to open it to know it would drip with bitterness. But she did. Of course she did. "You'll die alone in this house. Hope the silence comforts you when no one's left to visit." Joan smiled faintly. Not cruelly, not sadly. Just knowingly. She folded the letter neatly and tucked it in the drawer with other forgotten things. Trash, eventually. That evening, the locksmith arrived. The click of the new deadbolt was the sweetest sound she'd heard in months. She signed the paperwork, offered him tea, and stood in the doorway as he left. The porch light flickered on as the sun dipped low, casting the rosebush in a golden glow. She stepped outside, barefoot now, walked down the path they used to call the wishing walk, and looked back at her home, not just a house anymore, but a fortress. Not built of bricks or wood, but boundaries. Finally hers. As she walked back in, closing the door behind her, the letter on the mantel fluttered slightly in the breeze, its weight now irrelevant, But Joan's eyes narrowed as she noticed something else beneath it. A second note. Folded. Untouched. From Chris. Unopened. They left curses. I left signatures. The house was quieter than it had been in years, but it wasn't empty. It was cleared of tension, of manipulation, of two faces that had mistaken generosity for weakness. Joan moved through the space like someone rediscovering her own skin. She stood in front of the fireplace mantel, still staring at the second letter Chris had left behind. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the high shelf in the hallway closet, where April had stored her collection of overpriced handbags, each one a reminder of borrowed money and borrowed class. Joan grabbed a chair, climbed it, and pulled down 3 dust-covered Louis Vuitton and a still-tagged Gucci. By noon, she was smiling at the young woman working the front counter of the Women's Shelter Donation Center. "For the auction," Joan said. "Someone should enjoy them who actually earned them." She didn't wait for a receipt. Back home, sunlight streamed through the windows as if even the house had started breathing again. Joan sat down at her kitchen table, a cup of Earl Grey steaming beside her, and pulled out a pad of paper. She started sketching ideas: open shelves, a brighter backsplash, maybe even a breakfast nook like she'd always wanted. She'd put it off for years because Chris didn't like change, because April called the old kitchen quaint in a pitiful way. The next morning, she called a contractor. By the end of the week, demolition began. Every clatter of wood and tile hitting the trash bin outside sounded like justice. Crack. There went the shelf April complained wasn't aesthetically modern. Bang. There went the crooked cabinet door Chris promised to fix, but never did. Dust clouded the air, but Joan inhaled deeply. It smelled like renewal. When the kitchen was stripped bare, she walked through it barefoot, imagining the next chapter. Then she made her way to the sunroom, already filled with potted herbs and trailing ivy. She measured the wall for a new reading nook, built-in cushions, maybe a skylight. She wasn't rebuilding a house, she was building herself back into it. By the following Sunday, Joan hosted what she called her New Beginnings brunch. No children, no apologies, just 3 old friends from her book club, Mr. Dale's the realtor, and Eleanor from her morning walking group. Laughter returned to the rooms again, real, unfiltered. Eleanor raised her mimosa. "To freedom at any age." Joan clinked her glass gently. "To peace that can't be rented." They dined under warm light, homemade scones and fresh jam. When someone complimented the space, Joan finally said the words she'd been waiting to say. "It feels like mine again." That's when Mr. Dales leaned forward, wiping buttery crumbs from his mouth. "You ever thought about turning this whole story into a strategy?" Joan raised a brow. "What do you mean?" "You've got the house. You've got the name. Hell, you've got the smarts. I've got a listing for a duplex nearby, perfect for short-term tenants. Passive income, full control." Joan's eyes flicked to the window where the backyard caught the afternoon sun. Something stirred in her. Not vengeance, not even ambition, just clarity. She didn't answer right away, but she smiled. That evening, she finally opened Chris's letter. Only 4 words were written inside. "You really chose this?" Joan folded the paper in half, then in half again, then again, until it disappeared into the kitchen trash bin with the old blueprints. Her phone buzzed. A message from Mr. Dales. "Sending you the property listing. Let me know if you're ready to build your next trap." She turned off the lights. Her smile stayed on. "They said old people shouldn't have big houses. I said young people should pay for theirs." The irony didn't just knock. It strolled through the front door with its shoes off, settled into Joan's favorite chair, and poured itself tea. It had been 3 months since April and Chris had vacated Joan's home. Joan had since reclaimed every corner, emotionally, financially, even spiritually. But now a new opportunity had knocked, and it came wrapped in poetic justice. Joan stood beside Mr. Dales in a sunlit foyer of a freshly listed duplex property just 15 minutes from her house. The scent of fresh paint lingered in the air, clean, lemony, unblemished. He handed her the file. "Great rental potential. Detached units, both updated, high demand. You'll have a dozen applicants in a week. Joan didn't blink. I'll take it. Full asking price. Cash Dales grinned. You always did know when to strike. By the following week, the listing was live, and just as predicted, applications flooded in. One of them, however, made Joan pause, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was entirely too familiar. Name: April W. Reason for rental: recently separated, relocating for stability. Co-tenant: one minor child. Joan reread the application 3 times. Same handwriting, same desperate tone that used to drip from April's voice when asking for little favors. There was no mention of Chris, no husband listed. Just April, alone, trying to look composed on a digital rental form. She called Mr. Dales. "Should I approve this one?" he asked carefully. "I can reject her and say the unit's already spoken for." Joan's voice was calm, almost kind. "No, approve it." Dales exhaled. "Any special terms?" "Oh," she said, a small smile forming. "Very special." 2 weeks later, April walked into the duplex to sign paperwork, hair up in a messy bun, sunglasses hiding exhaustion, a toddler on her hip. She looked thinner, less glossy, the kind of woman who used to scoff at renters, now reduced to becoming one. Joan remained behind the scenes. Dales handled the lease meeting solo, but Joan had crafted every clause. No guests after 9 p.m. without written notice, no alterations to the property without written permission. Rent due on the 1st. $250 late fee applies immediately after midnight on the 2nd. 3-strike eviction policy. April signed each line briskly, barely glancing. Her child tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, can we go now?" She handed the lease back. Dales closed the folder. "Welcome to your new home." April blinked. "That's it?" Dales smiled politely. "One last thing," he said. "The managing member of the LLC that owns this property would like to leave you with a message." He handed her a crisp envelope. She opened it slowly. Inside, a printed postcard photo of Joan's old house, now remodeled, elegant, untouchable. Written beneath in neat black ink. "Some houses teach lessons. This one just charges rent." Management. April's hands trembled. Her eyes darted to the lease folder, flipping back to the top. Property owner: J. Whitmore, Holdings LLC. Managing member: Joan Whitmore. Her knees buckled just slightly. The paper fluttered from her hands. "Oh my God," she whispered. But there was no one left in the room to answer. Later that evening, Joan poured herself a glass of red wine. The sky was burning gold behind her rose garden. Her phone buzzed. One new message. From April. Subject: the lease. Message: was this a setup? Joan didn't reply. Instead, she opened the tenant portal and toggled Auto Renew on. You can't flip houses built on betrayal. Joan stood at the edge of her garden, the sun casting long amber rays across the freshly mowed lawn. A breeze whispered through the wisteria vines, curling their petals like soft secrets. The backyard buzzed with low conversation and the clink of crystal glasses, an elegant garden party in full swing. "Can you believe she's 70? Someone whispered near the lemonade stand. "I heard she hosts these every month," another replied. "And donates all the proceeds." Joan smiled faintly, sipping her cucumber spritzer. She didn't host these parties to show off. No, these events were her quiet revolution, a testament that life after betrayal didn't just go on, it bloomed. On the patio, her neighbors milled around decorated tables, each one themed with local causes: animal rescue, women's shelters, community gardening. Today's fundraiser was for senior housing rights, something Joan now championed with the kind of precision only a woman who'd signed eviction papers herself could understand. Her eyes drifted toward the white stone fountain at the garden's center, where a small bronze plaque read, "Freedom feels like flowers." She had paid for it using the first 3 rent checks from April. Across town, in a modest 2-bedroom duplex, April sat hunched at her kitchen table. calculating overdue bills with a pencil too short to hold properly. Her rent had increased again, market rates, nothing personal, and her savings were bleeding out like an untended wound. "Mommy, the heater's broken again," her daughter called from the hallway. April's lips tightened. "I know, baby. We'll call someone tomorrow." But she wouldn't. She knew who the landlord was now, and she hadn't dared to call in weeks. Back at the garden, Joan moved between guests with a grace that made her look taller than she was. Her white linen blouse fluttered in the breeze, pearl earrings gleaming under the sunlight. The smell of rosemary chicken wafted from the catering table, mingling with the scent of fresh soil and peonies. A neighbor handed her a small envelope. This came by courier earlier. Joan opened it casually, expecting another invitation or donor thank you. Instead, she froze for just a second, then exhaled slowly, eyebrows arching in amused surprise. Inside was a formal letter, thick paper, gold seal, elegant print. "We are pleased to inform you that you've been selected as this year's recipient of the Community Woman of the Year Award. Your strength, generosity, and leadership have become an example for women of all ages." She smiled, not a vengeful smile, not a smug one. Just full. "Looks like karma came with a plaque," she muttered to herself. Joan stepped forward to clink her glass gently with a spoon, gathering everyone's attention. The garden fell into a respectful hush. "I used to think peace came from silence," she began, "but real peace comes from being heard, respected, and never settling for less than you've earned." A murmur of agreement rose among the guests. She raised her glass. "To new beginnings, to knowing your worth, and to every woman who ever gave too much and finally took something back." Applause erupted. Somewhere behind her, a string quartet picked up again, playing a soft rendition of Clair de Lune. Joan looked toward her house, sunlight bouncing off the windows, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. Not just a house now, a sanctuary, a fortress, a story only she could write. She didn't think about April often anymore, not with bitterness anyway. April had become just another lesson, like taxes, thorns on roses, or the importance of reading the fine print. That evening, as Joan slipped off her heels and walked barefoot through her sunroom, a new notification pinged on her phone. Subject: Ceremony, invitation. You are formally invited to accept your award at next month's annual gala. Please prepare a 5-minute speech on legacy. Joan stared at the word, legacy, and she smiled, because now she finally had one. "They wanted me out of my house. I made sure they paid rent for theirs." The ballroom lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd. Dozens of glittering chandeliers cast golden reflections across polished wine glasses. Velvet-draped chairs were filled with city officials, philanthropists, and women of every age, their faces lifted toward the stage where the MC cleared her throat. "And now," she said, voice echoing softly through the sound system, "we present this year's Community Woman of the Year Award to a woman who turned her pain into progress, her silence into a strategy." A spotlight snapped to the stage stairs as Joan stood, wearing a navy gown that shimmered like ripples at dusk. She made her way up, each step deliberate, graceful. The applause was thunderous. Phones were raised. And in the very back row, someone gasped softly, recognizing the woman from a headline months earlier. Joan reached the podium, laid her speech on the stand, and paused. She didn't look at her notes. She didn't need to. She looked at the crowd, and she spoke. "When you lose someone, people expect you to shrink," she began. "They expect your world to get smaller, quieter, more polite." Laughter rippled through the room. "But I didn't shrink. I expanded. Because peace isn't found in surrender, it's earned in clarity. And sometimes that clarity looks like a contract, or a court win, or walking back into your home knowing no one can take it again." A few women clapped first. Then more joined, until the room erupted again. Joan's voice softened. This isn't just about property. This is about power, dignity, about owning not just your space, but your story. She looked straight ahead now, voice steady. I dedicate this award to every woman over 65 who's ever been told she should give up space, dreams, or choices. You don't owe anyone your silence just because you've outlived their timeline for your relevance. Standing ovation. A tear traced down her cheek. Not from pain, this was the release after a battle won. As cameras flashed, Joan accepted the crystal plaque, its edges catching light like sun on water. Engraved beneath her name were 4 words: claimed, reclaimed, never relinquished. Later that night, Joan slipped out of her heels at the threshold of her front door. Her own key clicked in the lock. The house greeted her with warm light and the scent of blooming night jasmine drifting through a cracked window. She walked slowly through the entryway. Her fingers skimmed the edges of the new sunroom chair she'd chosen herself. A watercolor painting of her garden, gifted by one of the local schoolchildren after her donation, hung above the fireplace. She passed the dining table, where once April had seated guests without asking. Tonight, it held fresh peonies and an untouched bottle of champagne. Joan sat on the couch, her gown draped around her like satin armor, and reached for her travel journal. She flipped through pages filled with notes from Italy, sketches from France, quotes from every book club she now ran. One page, near the back, had a single line written in thick black ink. Peace is not silence. It is ownership. She leaned back, exhaling deeply. Outside the window, the city pulsed in distant murmurs. But inside was hers. No whispers about downsizing, no smug jokes about moving on. No 1 inch of this home belonged to anyone who didn't respect her name. She stood again and moved toward the wall by the hallway. There, framed beneath soft lighting, hung a photo of her standing on the front porch, arms folded, chin lifted, taken the day April and Chris drove away for the last time. Below it, etched into a brass nameplate, were the words, "They wanted me out." So I gave them a price tag. Joan turned off the last lamp, leaving just the glow of the city skyline through her window. And with her hand on the doorknob to the bedroom, she said one last thing to herself, under her breath. Big house, big dreams, big enough to outgrow their small minds.